Larry Magid, and this is Doing Tech Right, a podcast from ConnectSafely, where we and our guests speak about parenting, tech, and related topics, along with strategies and policies to make tech safer and more civil. And if you like what you hear, please subscribe and visit us at ConnectSafely.org. Hi there. I'm really happy to be speaking to Dr. Cynthia Miller-Idriss, a leading expert on extremism, radicalization, and online polarization. She's a professor at American University, founding director of PERIL, the PERIL Lab, and author of Hate in the Homeland. We'll talk about how technology influences radicalization and what parents, educators, and the tech industry can do to prevent it. Dr. Cynthia Miller-Idriss, pleasure to have you. Thanks for joining us.
Nice to be here. Please call me Cynthia.
And what does PERIL stand for or mean? It's not
PERIL
like peril.
is, yes, it's the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab. We were looking for an acronym that people would remember, but also reflected the kinds of concerns and things that we were working on, which are online worlds mostly that are manifesting in offline harms, and sometimes vice versa.
Well, this is an incredibly timely conversation because we can't, I don't know if people pick up newspapers anymore, but we can't go online, take out our phone without hearing some story about someone who was apparently radicalized online and may have committed some horrendous act in the real world that cost lives or whatever. So it's a very important conversation. And when we hear the term online radicalization, you have this image that somebody may have been transformed by a single video or a single interaction. But my sense is that it's much more complicated than that. So I wonder if you tell me a little bit about how the radicalization process takes place, how it starts, and how it transforms over time.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's more complicated than a simple kind of pathway. And it's also getting more complicated. So it's sort of ever more complicated than it used to be. A typical pathway today for a young person, which is the population that tends to be the biggest risk of violence, is, at some point they're exposed, like almost everybody, to some sort of harmful content online, maybe extremely violent content, or maybe they're connecting with people in an online gaming context. So first of all, there's a desensitization that happens by spending a ton of time online, or even just time online that is algorithmically very targeted to you in ways that deliver content that ultimately can be harmful to your well-being. And then for certain people, most people, thankfully, recognize that harmful content and reject it, whether it's like sort of racist content or misogynist content or conspiratorial content. Most people do have, as we know, the ability to recognize and reject that, but not everybody does. Some people have more vulnerabilities than others. They may be more isolated. They may have had adverse childhood experiences that make them more emotionally dysregulated or lonely. They may start to form some sort of parasocial relationship with an influencer who they encounter online, who's delivering this, say, anti-Semitic content or harmful content to them that makes it more persuasive. Whatever it is, they may be manipulated by a deliberate recruiting effort by a bad actor who's either trying to sextort them or groom them toward other harmful acts, right? There's a lot of different ways that can happen. And then for those people, they start to latch on to worldviews that are not just radical, but even extreme. So, either extremely believe that violence is the solution to some other problem, believe that entire populations of people should be eliminated, or believe that the best way to their own status, right, to get more clout, to be a part of something bigger and better than themselves, is to produce very violent content in the world and then be admired as a martyr by others. So there's subcultural parts to this too.
There's always been some concern about video games because they can be misogynistic, they can celebrate violence. But for the most part, I think research has shown that people, young people included, understand the difference between fact and fiction. They understand these are games and they can separate out, just like when I was a kid, you watch, cowboys and Indians or cops and robbers or whatever it was, and you understood that this was fiction, not your life.
Right.
Online, and even in the media sometimes, you hear the dehumanization, you hear people being referred to as the enemy. How does that differ from the kind of fictional misogyny and violence that we see in games?
Yeah, well, it doesn't differ exactly, because the concern I have with games is not actually the content of the game. So that, as you point out, research has shown that violence in video games doesn't correlate with violence in the real world and is not something we really have to worry about that much. But what we do have to worry about with games are the in-game chats, which are live chat features with other human beings that are rife with, I mean, just incubators of misogyny, racism, homophobic bullying, all kinds of contents that are just kind of cultural norms in those spaces. And then the broader communities around games, like streaming services like Steam or Discord, right? Communities that are set up as platforms where you engage with the games that also introduce you to a lot of other human beings who you definitely don't know in person, and who may not actually be who they say they are. So there's two different types of dangers. One is the desensitization and dehumanization that can happen when you just get so used to saying racial or homophobic or misogynist slurs all the time, or are being bullied in that way. The other is the actual direct risk of being invited in one of those spaces into other encrypted spaces on Telegram or elsewhere, where you get more extreme content. And that is a very common pathway, for example, in nihilistic violent extremism, where Discord comes up a lot as the site that is one of the most frequent places where people first encountered somebody who was kind of looking for a vulnerable person who they could then recruit and start to manipulate into doing harmful things on video that they can then extort them to do bomb threats, to do school shootings. There have been 16 school shootings since 2023 tied to that particular extremist type of violence and recruiting. So, those are the ways that I worry about the games, not the content itself. The dehumanization part of it through getting so exposed, also in the mainstream, of course, from politicians and others who echo the same types of things. But also, it's like a gateway just to the rest of the world in a way that was totally different in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, before you really had these multiplayer live chat driven games where
Yeah.
you're really communicating with other players.
Earlier you mentioned, we were talking offline, that you'd spent some time in Germany.
Yeah.
I've spent a lot of time in Germany as well, and the German people are wonderful people. I've never had a terribly bad experience there. But it wasn't that long ago, as history hopefully will continue to recall, that the German people elected a fascist Nazi murderer who
Yeah.
did everything possible to dehumanize and literally murder millions of people. Did we learn anything from that? And also, how is that different or similar to what we're seeing today?
It's a great question. And there's a couple different things. One, I think, Germany is not immune to the same types of things that we're experiencing. So their Alternative for Germany party, which is
Yes.
so far right that the EU is considering, right? The European Commission is considering a ban against them when they're not doing that against other European governments, far right parties. So it is a very extreme party that has tremendous popularity in parts of the country. And so it's, just having the history and putting so much money into reckoning with that. I mean, they put a tremendous amount of money into telling the history and reckoning with the history of the Holocaust, and into prevention work, right? Primary prevention work. So who's to say that it wouldn't be worse if they hadn't done that? But in other words, they haven't solved the problem either. So I think,
Nor have
you know,
we.
yeah, right. Nor have we. Right.
Yeah.
So, like, one thing you learn from that is that we're all vulnerable to these types of political shifts that are anti-democratic, that are, sometimes dehumanizing, that are closed borders, but also, really retrenched gender norms, retrenched ideas about who belongs in a country, and not accepting kind of diversity or inclusive democracy as the norm. So, one thing to learn is that just having had a horrific past doesn't mean you won't go back, into some anti-democratic or even potentially authoritarian type levels of popularity. I mean, we're seeing that kind of surge in schools in Germany right now, which is a lot of what I was talking about. I don't think we can compare ourselves yet to, 1930s Germany, but certainly you can start to think about what happened in the Weimar Republic, like leading up to the election of a fascist leader, and how democracies that are failing, and that's an empirical fact. I mean, we are on a list of backsliding democracies now, since the end of 2021 globally, right? We are on a number of factors not thriving. And that's a list. When you look at the other people who are on the other countries on that list, you don't really want to be around them, right? That's not the models of like democracy that we think of our peers. And we haven't gotten off that list yet. So, on average, countries stay on it like 9 years, and we're about halfway through. So that's one thing you can learn from history, is that doesn't happen overnight. It takes a long time to slide into an anti-democratic state.
But of course, Hitler didn't have the internet, and now we do,
Yeah.
for
Yeah. I
both good
mean,
and bad. And how is the internet? What's the impact? It seems to be, is it accelerating? I mean, you talk about a long time. I mean,
yeah.
aren't things happening at a lightning speed today, in both
Well,
directions, with good and
things
bad?
spread at a lightning speed. And so, yes, I mean, I think what you see is like the ideas that are harmful. Like, I talk about the new misogyny in my most recent book, Man Up, like that it's not anything new, the arguments that are being
Of course.
expressed, there's so many more vectors to express it, right? The comment sections, the short form videos, the many different platforms that people spend time. And it's, not just the internet itself, but I do think what's happened in the last few years, the way algorithms themselves are prioritizing content based on what they think is going to keep you engaged, not necessarily what you want to see. So if you hit the dislike button, you're also going to get more of that content, right? Because it keeps you engaged. So it's how to keep you there, to keep those eyeballs, like to keep the engagement metrics high, to keep advertisers happy, is like salacious, outrageous, angry content, or it's content that creates emotional connection, parasocial relationships, or a feeling of being validated, right? And so those two things, the attachment economy and the attention economy, work together in ways that kind of make all this harmful content get embedded in a way that keeps you still there consuming it. So it's harder to walk away. We know that from the addictive features of social media. I mean, I will just say one thing about that. It's really interesting because countries around the world right now are rapidly implementing bans on social media for under 16-year-olds or under 15-year-olds in some countries. But Brazil did something different. Instead of banning it, they banned the addictive features,
Yeah.
and they made technology companies for minors, right? Stop autoplay, notifications, the infinite scroll, right? Like these features are features that can be turned off, which is actually pretty amazing. What
And
if
we
consumers
advocate at
had the
Connect
right to
Safely.
turn them off,
At
right?
Connect Safely, that's exactly what we are
Yeah,
pushing our partners and friends in the industry to do. And we just
yeah,
recently did a post on our front page talking about how we need to regulate, not ban, social
yes.
media for teens.
Absolutely, because the banning is certainly not going to work. And we already have the data out of Australia showing that in the
Right.
first 3 months, 85% of teenagers are still on it. It's very easy to get around it. And then you're also, because you think they're off it, not doing, I think, the digital media literacy work that you need to do in
Right.
countries to prepare kids to be on it when they are that age.
And of course, there are positive uses of social media,
Of
including
course, right.
including combating
Yeah.
hate.
Combating hate, connecting. I mean, the number of kids I hear from who say that, like, I wish that adults would understand that there are many positive things. One of them was like, I get recipes all the time on social media, right? That I cook. Or a lot of queer kids say that
Mhm.
they, especially if they're living in a region that is not supportive of LGBTQ identities, this is the place where they actually first start to feel less ostracized. And so you can, as somebody from a marginalized group in an area where they don't have that kind of support, it can be not just a positive thing, but a lifeline.
So I'm curious about where this is coming from. So we know that there are organized extremist groups, maybe even state-sponsored
Yeah.
government organizations
Yeah.
that are spewing this for very deliberate political reasons. But we also know, I believe, that there's a lot of people that are just doing it on their own.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious, could we solve the problem if we could just get rid of these incredibly well-resourced bad actors, or is it much deeper than that?
When you look at the intersections of harm and their origins, this is something I was just in a meeting with a bunch of other people talking about, like that the central node is profit and almost all of it, right? Like what's driving tech-enabled gender-based violence, what's driving gender disinformation content, what's driving conspiracy theories, right? Like in a lot of cases, it's either a foreign actor who is a malign foreign actor who's promoting that in order to polarize us, or it is a profiteer online who's actually trying to sell something. So they're trying to sell advertising dollars, or they're trying to get subscriptions, or sign up for my course, or buy this product, right? So there is a real profit driven motive to it, and that's partly why it sticks around, because people are making money off of it, or they're gaining votes off of it,
Mhm.
right? They're persuading voters, and so it's working in the way that the people who are doing it want it to work. So, one way to stop it is to try to interrupt that profit motive. And I don't know enough about how to do that, but I would say if you don't address the fact that it's so profitable, meaning both in dollars and in votes, if it wasn't so effective, people wouldn't be doing it in terms of like polarizing, scaring people, getting them to vote for solutions that might not be in their best interest, but feel comforting at the time, like close the borders or whatever, right? Like, something that is promising some sort of restoration. All of these things are profitable to people who want their votes or want this to happen. So I think that's one of the things that absolutely has to happen, is to think about the profit motive, to think about how do you interrupt people taking advantage of people's fears, stoking those fears, and then selling them a solution that is not in their own interest.
So I have quite a few followers on Facebook. I know it makes me sound old because I am old. And I will post things that are quasi-political or provocative simply to get people to interact.
Yeah.
And for the most part, we have these really, I think, productive conversations, sometimes
Yeah.
involving hundreds or even thousands of followers.
It's
But
great.
inevitably, there are those who are going to fill it with hate, are going to, what's the word, be very disrespectful of
Yeah.
others, and
Yeah.
also spread misinformation.
Right.
And I always wonder, as an individual, as just a person out there, on Facebook or Instagram or Snapchat or wherever you are, what can you do in a safe way, not in a way that's going to jeopardize your physical safety, to counter that kind of material when you see it, whether it's in comment section of a feed or whether somebody's posting something that's just wrong, even if it isn't necessarily extremist,
Right.
or potentially could be extremist, or maybe bordering on extremist.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, especially because sometimes these are bots, right? So they're
Yep.
actually not even worth arguing with because they're not real people. They're just
If
there
you can
to,
figure that out,
right,
which I know
exactly.
we
So
can.
one is trying to figure out, being critical about who this is and what their purpose is. Are they just blowing off steam? Are they a bot? Which, um, a lot of users on social media now are bots, right? So you have to, like, if you're getting you're seeing the same repeated comment, the account is making the same comment. You can, or you look at their account and you can see that they don't have any followers, right? They are following so many people, right? So you can kind of see, like, is this a legitimate account that's trying to engage, or is it just like dumping harmful and hateful and divisive speech in order to try to polarize and shake things up?
Yeah.
So I would say if you're pretty confident that it's a real person, who's actually following and engaging, and then you can try to engage with like a counter argument, but I wouldn't go way down the rabbit hole. Like, it tends to be not super productive to argue with people on social media if they're making polemical or statements that are not factual or not in good faith, because they're not probably there to have dialogue or discussion, right? The only thing is, like, I have done that myself, engaged with people, and if you can make it clear that you're listening, you're engaging with empathy, you're not clapping back in a super judgmental way, and not in a way that's going to escalate, but then in a way is intended to de-escalate, to say, I respect your opinion, but I see this differently. Here's why, right? But
Mhm.
that requires time. And that's something a lot of us maybe don't have the time to go into a lot of education of other people in individual ways in the comment section. So I think it's generally worth, if you have the time, one or two interactions, but then if it's not proceeding in a respectful way, definitely
Yeah.
just
I
either.
have a friend actually has a PhD,
Yeah.
very smart guy, and he's posted a fair amount of just wrong information. He happens to be on the left. He reads these left-leaning publications, and not all of them are factual. And he'll post things, and
Yeah.
I don't care whether it's left or right if it's wrong.
Yeah, that's great
I
if
want-
you know who the person is, and then you don't have to go through all the stuff in the beginning of, is this a real person? And then I think, you can, if you have the time and you can engage with it, you can say, like, this
yeah.
actually isn't true, or that's AI generated, without embarrassing them, without shaming them. That's really important, because when you start to shame people or judge them or embarrass them or humiliate them in those kind of contexts, they do tend to go further into the rabbit holes, further online into the open arms of people who say, well, see, this is why those folks will never accept you or whatever. And so it's like, it has to be done. It's true with conspiracy theorists too. with empathy, with repeated engagement and care, especially if you know the person, then
Yeah.
it's worth trying.
Now, let's talk about young people. I know you do a lot of work with young people. And what is it about adolescents that makes them more vulnerable to, or are they more vulnerable to extremist messaging?
They are more vulnerable, although there's been changes in those averages over the last several years, particularly during the pandemic. They're more vulnerable for a couple different reasons. One, they're identity seeking. So they're actually trying to figure out who they are. And that's true for every adolescent. They're figuring it out. And so they're more open. They have less confident, asserted, and completed kind of identities. I mean, we're all evolving over time, but especially adolescents. They're still figuring it out. They're still trying to differentiate themselves from their parents, political opinions, let's say. And so they're starting to explore. And so in that exploratory identity formation moment, there's more risk for finding an identity that wraps itself around hateful or harmful things that might not align with their actual values, but seem persuasive at the time. Or, they might be more responsive to what we call instructed victimhood, which is where somebody out there is telling you like these very real grievances that you have, like affordability crisis or whatever. These are actually all the fault of whomever, immigrants or Jews or women or feminists or the liberal state or whatever, or, for example, right? That's just one example. Or from the left, we get this like that, the anger, legitimate anger at the healthcare industry then becomes like a persuasive celebration of violence enacted against the healthcare CEO, or feeling like violence is somehow a justifiable response. So those things might start to seem more persuasive when you're still trying to figure out your identity. They're also more likely to take
cynicism.
risks.
I thought we were going with the healthcare. I mean,
Yeah.
the cynicism about the healthcare industry, could also lead you into a alternative medical
Oh,
lifestyle, which could be
absolutely,
positive.
right?
I mean,
Yeah,
I'm
if
all
you
for
had a bad
vitamins.
experience with with mainstream medicine, and this is true for a lot of women, for example, who had a bad experience with pregnancy and childbirth in an overly medicalized sometimes situation, or they weren't listened to, or they feel like they don't understand the research and they're worried. And so they're persuaded by these questions about safety around vaccines because, they don't want to do anything that might potentially harm their child. And so they're so worried and so fearful that they get more persuaded by pseudoscience or
Yeah.
false science, right?
Yeah.
So that can happen. I think it's not
Well,
just,
even reportedly, even Steve
yeah,
Jobs, when he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, the reports are that he didn't do the medical
yeah,
procedures, but he went to alternative medicine, which again, I'm not necessarily opposed to. I mean,
right,
nothing
right,
wrong with vitamins and natural sources, but
yeah,
in lieu of necessary medical intervention, it
yeah,
could have possibly led to his early demise.
yeah, exactly. I mean, this is like, so what I mean about like people being persuaded by stuff that might not be in their own interest, but somehow seems to them to be the right choice at the time. So, one reason why adolescents are more persuaded by it, as are people who are in other moments of transition, right, into retirement or into parenthood, right? These moments when your identity is shifting and you're trying to grapple with something new can be more vulnerable. So that's one reason adolescents are more vulnerable. They're also just like they might not have processed so many of their earlier childhood experiences with bullying or with isolation and loneliness or struggling with peer groups. And so there's some resentment and anger sometimes that then finds a place in online communities,
Mm-hmm.
again, who blame other people for, the unfair treatment they've experienced. And so there can be a lot of different reasons, but it's not just running toward bad things. I think it's really important to remember that people are also universally in need of meaning, of belonging, of a
Yeah.
sense of purpose in their lives. And that doesn't mean, that sense of purpose is always a positive one for democracy or for inclusion or multicultural societies. Like if they start to find a sense of purpose in a white supremacist group because it has a very clear idea of what the future should look like and they feel like they're a part of something bigger and better than themselves, that's really clear in the research. It can
Yeah.
lead them into some really harmful
Yeah.
things.
Gangs, cults,
Yeah,
even some
exactly.
extreme
Yeah,
religious
we see this
organizations all take advantage of that sense of
exactly.
belonging, and
Hmm.
it can be very reassuring for a while.
Yeah,
I'm almost afraid to ask this question because
yeah,
whenever I ask about early warning signs, I always worry about false positives because there's
yeah,
always going to be there's always something to worry about. Oh,
yeah,
my kid did this, my kid did that. But are
yeah.
there any things that parents should look for in their children's activities, behaviors, online
Yeah.
experiences that indicate the possibility that maybe they're going down a rabbit hole?
Absolutely, there are. And, the reason why I like sort of talking about some of these warning signs is because they're actually just warning signs of a lot of possible bad
Yeah.
things that are the same, right? So suddenly cutting yourself off from other groups of friends, right? At that moment when you're no longer talking to, to one particular friend group, but you're getting new friends, being more secretive, starting to say things that don't align with your family's values sometimes can be, right? So suddenly spouting anti-immigrant things, right? Or starting to say things that maybe weren't common in the household before. But there's also there's a particular set of extremist trends that are happening right now among teenagers, which are these online exploitation ones that in some cases lead to sextortion, in other cases lead to grooming for extremist acts of violence.
Yeah.
They're all bad, and they're called 764 or nihilistic violent extremism. And a lot of the recent teenage driven, including in San Diego and elsewhere, have been driven in part by this cluster of things. Those warning signs are often things like cutting, right? So like cut, which is a warning sign of a lot of different things. But if sometimes those groups require you to cut signs into your body on video. And so cutting with a razor, or to hurt a sibling or an animal in the house on video, and then they blackmail you into doing worse things like calling in bomb threats to schools or those types of things with that footage. And so it's one of the darkest things that we work on in the lab, is the set of tools designed to inform parents, mental health counselors, teachers, other educators about these kinds of tactics. And so really, it's like parents, I find, usually can tell that there's something wrong. And this is what they often will say. They knew something was wrong. They just didn't know what it was. And
Yeah, but the
so,
problem is that,
yeah.
I mean, having raised two children through adolescence, there's always something wrong.
There's always something wrong. Yes.
And it's like, it's sort of like, you stub your toe and you wonder, should you go to the doctor? Well, it's probably a stubbed toe, but maybe you broke your foot. I mean, those kinds of senses, not knowing for sure.
Yeah, exactly. And it's, there's a mom in the UK who Brock was her son, and she runs a foundation now in his name, who was groomed online over a video game by a predator. And she said she knew he was being groomed. She actually could hear it happening. She just didn't know, and they took away his device, and then the perpetrator sent another device, right? Like it's in the mail. It was an 18-year-old, grooming her son. And in the end, she's like, she knew it was happening, but she didn't know what the purpose was. Was this sexual exploitation? Was this terrorism? Was it? And so I think a lot of times what you hear afterward is that, also most school shooters, for example, most terrorist actors leak their intentions to someone in the family. So it often doesn't come as a total surprise. People see that there are things happening. One, they don't know how to get help because we don't have enough community-based resources for these types of things. Or two, there's nothing illegal happening anyway. And so even when they try to get help, so you have a lot of cases where parents in El Paso or in others, cases of terrorist attacks where the parents have called the police, but nothing illegal was happening. The gun was legally purchased. They're over 18. And so it can be
call that
very, very
lawful
hard.
but awful.
Yeah, exactly.
There's a lot of that. We talked a little bit about algorithms earlier, but what can industry do? I mean, because a lot of this does take place in places that are run by big corporations. In fact, some of the world's largest corporations.
I mean, absolutely. I would love to see industry shut down the addictive features. I think the idea that we don't have, or at least allow consumers the right to turn off those addictive features, which most of the platforms don't do, allow an easy way to reset your algorithm on every platform. You should be able to do that once a day, just like you clear cookies out of your browser, right? We should be able to just clear your algorithm so that you're resetting and you're not getting, that even if you could set it to do that every hour, right? I'd love to have my, and some of the platforms have a way to do it, but it's really hard. And so
the problem is, if I can play devil's advocate for a minute, I actually once did that on my Facebook feed and it got really boring. I wish there was a way I could have tweaked it to say, I just don't want to hear this kind of stuff, but I still want to hear from people.
You can do that sometimes with sponsored content, but for example, I would really like to have a feedback on my social media the way that it used to be when there's no sponsored, recommended, or promoted content. Because sometimes I will just open up Facebook, for example, because I'm also old, and be like, all of a sudden, I'm like, I scroll past 8 or 9 or 10 videos without seeing anything from anybody I actually follow.
Yeah, I know.
And the whole point of the Facebook is to connect with people from grad school, from high school, from whatever. It's just these different walks of life. And it's lovely to see what they're up to, even though it's not always real. And it's like their best version or worst version of themselves. As kids tell me, that's one of the pieces of advice that teenagers I talked to just this summer said they would tell their younger siblings is that just remember, like, you're only seeing people's best or worst
Oh,
days. It's
absolutely.
not right. It's like, it's not average. And so I wish that there was I wish there was more control and more education about how to control what's in your feed.
Yeah.
And then less promotion of the salacious, outrageous, divisive content because of the engagement metrics.
This has been a really nice conversation.
It's been a great conversation. I really enjoyed it.
And how do people find out more about you?
So I have a website. You can look at my individual writings and authorship books that are coming out, www.cynthiamilleridriss.com. But also my lab is www.perilresearch.com, PERIL research.com. All of our tools for digital media literacy that we create for the public are free. They're downloadable. We offer trainings. We have videos. We have all kinds of curriculum and stuff that's out there that is tested and can help. And so please have a visit and get some tools and shoot us an email at peril@american.edu if you have questions.
Cynthia Miller-Idriss, thank you so much. Doing Tech Right is produced by Christopher Lee. Maureen Kochan is executive producer. Theme music by Will Magid. I'm Larry Magid.